Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Jewish Studies event. I'm Liora R, Director of the Yasser Carnal Jewish Studies Program and Associate Professor of Jewish and Middle Eastern Studies here at the College of Charleston. And I'm happy to welcome all of you here and all of our viewers on Zoom to another, what is likely to be a great event. Tonight's talk is titled The Oldest Guard, Landowners, Local Memory, and the Making of the Zionist Settler Past. And it is generously sponsored by the Arnold Center for Israel Studies here at the College of Charleston. Now, before I introduce our speaker, just a quick announcement, or a couple of announcements, however you want to have it. First, this Thursday, we have a Film Fest event that actually takes place at KKBE, so that's down the street. That's a screening of the film Shared Legacies and a program with Rabbi Alexander and a few other people. And that's down there at KKBE at, I think 7, right? I don't have time for that, but I assume it's 7 p.m. Then next Wednesday at 6 p.m., we will hold the annual Arnold Nenmero Lecture with Father Patrick Dubois, who is one of the leading voices for human rights, Holocaust remembrance, and genocide prevention in our times. And that is really a talk not to be missed, and it will be available only in person. There's no Zoom option for that. You have to show up if you want to see it. It's in Rita Hollings 101. That's the science building down the street. We have a few other events coming up this semester, so you may want to check out our Facebook page or on our website, jewish.cfc.edu/events. Okay, so now for tonight's event. Our speaker tonight is Professor Liora Halperin. She's a professor of Jewish Studies and History and the chair in Israel Studies at the University of Washington. She is a cultural and social historian with particular interest in nationalism and collective memory, language, ideology, and policy, and Jewish-Arab relations in Palestine under Ottoman and British rule. As well as the early years of the State of Israel, right? She received her PhD from UCLA in 2011. Professor Halperin is the author of numerous articles in various prestigious journals, such as the Journal of Social History, Jewish Social Studies, Middle Eastern Studies, Jewish Quarterly Review, and so on. Her first book, Babel in Zion, Jews, Nationalism, and Language Diversity in Palestine, appeared with Yale University Press in 2015. And was also awarded the Shapiro Prize from the Association for Israel Studies for the best book in Israel Studies. Her second book, The Oldest Guard, Forging the Zionist Settler Past, was published by Stanford University Press in 2021, so fairly recently, and it tells the story of Zionist settler memory in and around the private Jewish agricultural colonies, or moshavot, established in the late 19th century Ottoman Palestine. Tonight's talk has a slightly different title than the title of the book, as you may remember if you paid attention to what I said at the beginning of my introduction. That's me as the teacher speaking, of course. But if not, that's okay, because we have our guest with us here to explain all of that to us. So please join me in welcoming Professor Liora R.
Okay, this is where I check the mic. Is the mic good?
Good.
Okay, great. I'll make my way over here. All right, well, thank you so much, Yaron, for the warm introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you in this room. How many folks are on Zoom, Kim?
6,000.
6,000. 6,000. Well, it's great that you guys are here too, even though I can't see you. My book came out in 2021. But due to COVID, the first year plus of events were all on Zoom. So I gave a whole lot of Zoom presentations, but this is actually only my second in-person event. So it still feels very new, and it's really such a pleasure, very different than being online. All right, so I want to start by giving you a little bit of a sense of how I got into this topic to begin with. And in fact, the pathway that led me towards this research started with a family story. So what you see up here on the screen is a family photo. The man is my great-grandfather, Morris or Moshe, and the woman is his sister, Razel, or Rose or Shoshana. So both of them were born in Ottoman Jerusalem in the late 19th century. They were from an Ashkenazi religious family that had actually been in Palestine since the very beginning of the 19th century. So one of the oldest Ashkenazi families in Jerusalem. So those communities were religious communities that significantly predated the waves of rural settlement that began in the last quarter of the 19th century and which paved the way, at least looking in retrospect, paved the way for the more organized Zionist movement of the early 20th century. So Rose, or Razel, and her brother were from that more traditional community, but Razel actually made her way from Jerusalem to Jaffa, which was Palestine's main port, really booming in that era. And while she was there, she met a man who had relatively recently arrived from Romania. He was a religious Yiddish speaker, just like her, but he had settled in one of the very earliest agricultural colonies, Rishon LeZion, which had been founded in 1882. So these early agricultural colonists relied on the existing Jewish religious communities for so many of their needs, right? They were not separate. And it's likely coming into Jaffa for shopping or sales or anything else that he met my great-great-aunt, Razel. So Razel met the man who would become her husband, and this is him, Yaakov Abramovich. And I want to just tell you, there's Yaakov Abramovich, sorry. I want to tell you a little something about the Abramovich family. So the Abramovich family had arrived in the colony of Rishon LeZion in 1884. His family was part of a very tiny group of individuals who decided to take up agricultural settlement after being inspired by a certain stream of Jewish Enlightenment ideas that Jews could be both culturally and economically revitalized by engaging in agriculture. Many were also impelled out of either the Pale of Settlement or Romania and the Austro-Hungarian Empire because of violence against Jews and also economic instability. So it was both an idea of a pathway towards Jewish productivity and revival, but also a pathway they hoped to self-sufficiency and safety. So what you're seeing here, this document here, is a document I found in the Central Zionist Archives in Jerusalem, which are records of the Rothschild Foundation, which managed and financially supported the Rishon LeZion colony starting soon after its founding. So according to this document I learned from the archive, his family owned 110 dunams, which is about 28 acres of land, and they grew on that land several varieties of wine grapes. So this is what Rishon LeZion was and remains known for in many ways, is its famous winery. But unfortunately, tragedy struck the family of Yaakov and Razel. On September 23rd, 1902, Razel heard a gunshot outside of her home, and when she rushed outside to see what had happened, her neighbors ushered her in the direction of the Great Synagogue, which was the central institution of a community that had been founded by religious Jews. And there she learned what had happened. So Yaakov, her husband, who was 27 years old at the time, had been shot and killed during an altercation with a wealthy Christian Arab man who had come from Jaffa with some family and friends to picnic and probably enjoy some of the colony's famous wine. For reasons that are not entirely clear, he got into a scuffle with another Jewish man. Yaakov tried to intervene, and in the course of this was shot. So this is Yaakov's tombstone. You can see how he's described on his tombstone, which I was able to visit in the cemetery. Some years later, before World War I, Razel, who later became known as Rose, would follow my own great-grandfather, Moshe, who became Morris, to the United States. So her story and my great-grandfather's story would become bound up in this much bigger narrative of the 2 million or so Jews most of them, although not all of them, Yiddish speaking, who came to the United States during the late 19th and early 20th century. And in fact, the connection to Ottoman Palestine would become in many ways a footnote, right? That family was an Ashkenazi family, just like my mother's family, which had come directly from Eastern Europe, was an Ashkenazi family. But I'm a historian, I know how to do work in Israeli archives, and I decided I was going to look into this branch of my family. And it's in that context that I found out about this murder, about the murder case that followed, and then ultimately through twists and turns until I developed a project that was far larger, actually really not about my family at all, to understand these agricultural colonies and the kind of meaning that they had. So my book, after some years of multiple visits, is a book about how community leaders and ordinary residents of agricultural colonies founded by Jews in the late 19th century made sense of and made meaning of stories about colonists like Yaakov Abramovich and others. And I found that I wanted to understand not only what it meant for a small number of those early settlers to die or be killed at the hands of Arabs, which was actually quite rare at that time, but really primarily what did that act of settlement in a rural agricultural context mean for those who lived. So whether those were elderly settlers who lived to old age and were there to tell about their youth, or later generations living in the cities and towns that grew from those agricultural colonies between the 1920s and the 1960s, a period when Palestine passed first to British rule, and then, of course, in 1948 to Israeli rule. How did these communities understand this first wave of settlement as part of the Zionist story? How did they understand their position or their family's position in the broader Zionist story? So let me give you a sense of, let me give you a sense of where we're talking about. So this is, of course, the Google map. You can see Rishon LeZion, you can see Tel Aviv and Jaffa. You can see that distance is only about 7 miles. So we're talking about a pretty kind of, right now, Rishon LeZion is part of the broader Tel Aviv metropolitan area. So in the next few slides, I want to take you through a series of maps to give you a sense of some of the places and the spatial relationships that I think are key to understanding the meanings that became attributed to these places over time. And then I'll turn to some of the archives that brought me into the historical heart of places like Rishon LeZion and helped me paint a picture of what this wave of settlement meant to those generations who followed. Maps, archives. All right. So this is a map of those agricultural colonies that became central to my research. Rishon LeZion is currently the 4th largest city in Israel after Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa. And it's the largest Israeli city that began as a Jewish agricultural colony in the late 19th century. But you can see some of the others on this map. So you can see they're clustered in a few areas around the country. To this day, those particular communities are still referred to by the Hebrew term moshavot. Aaron mentioned it in his introduction, which is a direct Hebrew translation of the word colonies. Starting in around the 1920s, just after the British took control of Palestine during World War I, these moshavot came to be known as exemplars of a wave of Jewish migration known as the First Aliyah, or the first sort of named or numbered wave of pre-1948 Jewish land settlement, even though by no means were they the first Jews in Palestine. But this is where things get tricky, because it's not quite right to call these colonies Zionist. And let me explain why. The earliest of these colonies predated Theodor Herzl's Zionist organization of 1897, some of them by 15 years or more. And despite the fact that they became later known as the first, they long had an ambivalent relationship to the Zionist movement. And I'll give you a few reasons why that's the case. So these First Aliyah colonies remained in private hands, even as the Zionist organization, collecting funds from the larger Jewish diaspora, started to try to purchase lands in the name of the Jewish people. So Jewish National Fund lands are not owned by any one person. The idea is that they would be owned by the Jewish people. This was not the case with these privately purchased lands. Secondly, these First Aliyah colonists often remained religiously traditional. These are not the secular kibbutzniks who would follow in the early 20th century. Many of them, to different extents, were really quite religious people. They were also unorganized politically. So you think of the sort of socialist, Zionist pioneer, these folks were actually quite conservative politically and broadly unorganized. And then finally, and this was really the bone of contention, from their early years, but well into the 20th century, they hired native Arab labor for their farm work. All of these features rendered them suspect in the eyes of a set of movements known collectively as labor Zionism. So that's the kibbutz that many folks have heard of. Those movements, which date to the first decade of the 20th century, aside from the kibbutz, are known for promoting Jewish-only labor practices, which they called Hebrew labor, right? The Jews should hire Jews to do all of the work in a farm setting. And the earliest exemplars of this ideology, secular, socialist, pro-Hebrew labor, came to be known as the Second Aliyah. First Aliyah, Second Aliyah. I'm doing this weird thing with two screens, which is why if my slides aren't lining up, it's because I'm trying to figure things out here. Okay. So this First Aliyah versus Second Aliyah conflict over labor practices, ideology, social mores, brings me to map number 2, which I now realize you've been looking at for a few minutes. But now let me explain what it is. So this is a detailed map of Jewish land holdings in Palestine as of 1944. So the First Aliyah colonies are shown circled in black on this map, and you can see that all of them are on land marked as green, which is the privately owned land. The Zionist-owned lands, which are the Jewish National Fund lands, are the lands shown in blue. And you can see the geographic, kind of spread. But I want to call attention to the fact that there's a lot of green lands on this map, right? Despite the rhetorical kind of prominence of labor Zionism, of Jewish National Fund lands, in fact, by 1936, 3/4 of Palestine's Jewish population lived in the green areas. They lived on privately purchased, privately owned lands. And in fact, these lands produced Palestine's largest crop, which was oranges, right? The famous Jaffa orange for export. Initially alongside a very large Arab citrus industry doing the same. And yet, in many ways, the history of labor Zionism, of the Jewish National Fund, of socialists, has very much displaced the moshavot, these private earlier settlements in collective memory, and in fact, in a lot of the history of Zionism that's been written. So part of this project was recovering a story of Zionists who were not labor Zionists, who actually had a lot of strife with labor Zionists, who were committed to private ownership and private enterprise. The conflict between labor Zionists and their predecessors, the more conservative religious folks that I was looking at, is encapsulated in a great satirical anecdote from the 1940s. In it, an ideological Jewish worker, a labor Zionist, addresses a Jewish landowner in Hebrew. But this farmer, not understanding, turns to his Arab worker, and remember, these folks are hiring Arabs, and asks him in Yiddish, Muhammad, Muhammad, what is he saying, right? I don't understand this Hebrew. Okay, so why is this a joke? Well, it's a joke because it neatly encapsulates the stereotype of the First Aliyah type, right? He has Arab workers, he's a speaker of Yiddish since he hasn't bothered to learn Hebrew. And ironically, and this is what makes it funny, the Arab worker seems to understand Hebrew better than the Jewish farmer, right? Such that he can serve as the translator. And it's to this Arab worker that I'm going to turn next. So that brings us to map number 3, which is just an overlay on the last map that you saw. So the last map, map number 2, showed blue and green different models of Jewish land ownership on a white background. That map, map number 2, pretty much erases, or at least doesn't pay attention to Muhammad, this fictional Arab worker. And so we can ask the question, well, where is he in this story? Right? Who were these Arab workers that Abramovich and his father almost certainly hired to tend their vineyards? For that matter, where is the man from Jaffa who killed my great-grandfather's brother-in-law? And I discovered along the way that it was a man named Alfred Roque, who would actually go on to be active in the Palestinian nationalist movement in the 1920s, which is another story altogether. So whether those Arab figures are enshrined in memory as nameless workers or as violent outside aggressors, the reality is that they weren't somewhere off stage in another reality. They were right there in the colony itself. The Australian historian Penelope Edmonds, who has studied Aboriginal laborers who worked in Australian agricultural contexts, has argued that the frontier is not just a line on a map. It was often domestic, local, and personal, right? These contexts didn't occur outside Jewish space, they often occurred inside Jewish space. And many of these First Aliyah colonists, because of these personal connections, developed memories and told stories of a certain kind of coexistence with their Arab workers. And I'm going to turn to that a little bit later. And so the map that you're seeing here annotates the map to show many of the nearby Arab villages that supplied labor to the colonies, sometimes opposed land sales through violence, and sometimes entered into personal relationships with early settlers. As many of you know, in 1948, upwards of 700,000 Palestinians, and almost all of those in this part of the country, that central coastal area, were displaced from the country or sometimes internally displaced in the midst of the Israeli War of Independence. And most of them had no way to return. So Palestinians remember this as the Nakba, right, the catastrophe. But before and after 1948, those Arab workers in particular remained important characters in the local memory. Right? Everybody had their memories of Arab villages, of Arab workers. So the private farmers that I'm interested in and their descendants over the decades insisted that they had a story that was worth telling, and one that was both part of the Zionist story, but different than the one that had become mainstream. They claimed that their ancestors were moderates, were pragmatists, were people who had made financial investments in support of the Jewish economic future. They also defined that period by working relationships between Jewish owners and Arab employees, precisely at a time that labor Zionists were saying, we don't want Arabs around in our working context. These are people who are trying to craft their version of the past at the local level. And I take a term used by a Canadian historian who writes about commemoration in Montreal to refer to this group, heritage elites, right? These folks were not always popular among the growing Jewish working class, but they held local power, often on their municipal or local councils. They owned land, they commanded resources, and they did as much as they could to try to promote memories that would circulate beyond their circles. And interestingly, because of their identity as social conservatives, religious, etc., they also drew some support along the way from more right-wing Zionists, from Sephardi Jews, both of which groups were suspicious of the labor Zionist leadership. So there's this very interesting kind of center-right, you might say, coalition that emerges around memory and around the past. These elites did the things that would produce the documents for my research. They gathered personal documents, they took oral histories, they planned events, built exhibitions, hosted visiting school children, and more. And they also wrote about their efforts, at least some of them did. And those creations became my sources for this project. Okay, so I want to turn now to some of the sources and some of the stories and some of the claims that came out of this work. They're sources that show at least some pieces of what this commemoration looked like and what kind of political work it was doing in their present, even and sometimes especially when its promoters promoted it as being non-political or outside the realm of partisan politics. These were folks who were eager to promote the economic development they felt their towns represented to all sorts of observers, and not only Zionists, but also to imperial and international observers. And one of those imperial observers was someone maybe some of you have heard of, Arthur James Balfour. He had been the British Foreign Secretary, and if you know of him, you probably know of him for issuing a very famous, very short declaration known as the Balfour Declaration of 1917. So this is 1925. He decides to visit Palestine, now under British rule. He visits a few different places. One of them was Petah Tikva, which is maybe the other, besides Rishon LeZion, really major colony that grew out of this period, one of a few major colonies. And when he arrived, the colony owners and dignitaries greeted him with an impressive display of horses and greenery. And in fact, there's a documentary film, very brief clip that actually shows this. So why are they showing off to the British? The British had been tasked after World War I by the League of Nations for developing Palestine economically. And they were supposed to develop it for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. But along the way, they wanted to do so with as little burden to the British taxpayer as possible. So right after the British have taken control, the Secretary of State for the colonies in Britain said, 1923, by giving Jews the opportunity to develop Palestine, we are serving the interests of civilization as a whole, part of which economic development, quite apart from any sentimental considerations about restoring an ancient scattered people to its ancient fatherland. Okay, so they're saying, okay, like we know they have this story about wanting to return to their ancient homeland. We see them as good folks to develop this land economically, okay? And that was happening overwhelmingly through private investment, not through Zionist organized politics. So the moshavot, the First Aliyah colonies, saw this as a great opportunity to present themselves as exemplars of progress beyond politics, economic development beyond nationalism. Okay. The British were, in fact, impressed. On another British official visit, this time to Rishon LeZion, the High Commissioner for Palestine, John Chancellor, visits during the 1931 grape harvest, and he praised the Jewish settlers' seemingly apolitical achievements. He said, work alone, not politics, is what illuminates the path of life. But as a testament to the underlying politics of this non-political activity, I found the speech cited in an Arabic language newspaper. This was a newspaper being read by the Jewish colonists' Arab competitors, who also were, operating in the agricultural export market. They too, the Arab growers, were very well attuned to the national and political importance of Jews trying to prove their economic vitality to the British. And so the High Commissioner's assessment reflected a kind of ethos of Jewish private farming that tried to differentiate work from politics. Oh, those labor Zionists, they're doing their socialist politics. We're doing work. Okay, we're serving the larger ambitions. Another source sort of to this end was written by another young private farmer in 1908, trying to defend himself against the claim that private owners, Jewish owners, were firing Jewish workers in order to hire Arabs. And he protested saying, I love Jewish workers, just not class-conscious Jewish workers. That's my paraphrase. What he actually said is, give us workers for the sake of work, not for the sake of ideological conquest, okay? Okay, the Jews just gonna go do the work, no problem, but I don't like these folks who are like doing political organizing at night and coming to work tired the next morning. That was in the same word. But even as they sought non-ideological Jews, if they could find them as workers, these First Aliyah employers continued to make use of the cheaper Arab labor into the 1930s. These relationships, of course, were economic relationships. They were transactional by nature, right? Work for a wage, and they were often exploitative. And most colonists really didn't learn much Arabic, but they did know sufficient Arabic to converse with their Arab help. I found a source from 1914 saying they know only sufficient Arabic to converse with their Arab wagon driver. But nonetheless, even this limited knowledge of Arabic distinguished these private farmers from their Hebrew labor promoting colleagues who often didn't have Arab employees at all and couldn't even, function at the limited level. And those settlers from the First Aliyah who did achieve spoken proficiency in Arabic became particularly important symbols of what they saw as coexistence. And in my book, I call it hierarchical coexistence. Coexistence within an economic hierarchy. I want to give you kind of a story of the way that these stories of coexistence were promoted. One of those stories, printed in the Hebrew press, actually came from someone, an Arab man who had worked as a wagon driver. And that's this man in the middle, Nasser Ghanem, also known as Abu Farid. So Abu Farid, which is like father of Farid, kind of a colloquial way to call a person, had worked for a prominent family in Zichron Yaakov, another colony from this era, the Aronson family, who, side note, were particularly known for doing World War I espionage for the British, which is a whole other story. But this source is actually from 1939. And in 1939, on the 20th anniversary of Aronson's death, Abu Farid was interviewed by another sort of descendant of the First Aliyah. So what does he say in this interview? Abu Farid is remembering his relationship with his employer, Aronson. And he's quoted as saying that he remembers Aronson telling him, listen, Abu Farid, if I make a pita, we'll have to split it equally. If we sit down to eat, you aren't my servant, we're equal. Even if you wait for me at the entrance to the inn, holding the reins of the horses and help me get on the horse once we get to Jerusalem, here on the road, we're brothers, and so we would be always. Okay, so this is Abu Farid remembering his employer saying, hey, there's no hierarchy here, we're just friends, we're brothers. So what's Aronson doing? He's promoting a certain kind of coexistence. The Arab worker depends on the Jewish employer, but the Jewish narrator perceives and tells the story of the relationship as an equal one. In fact, as evidence that these private colonies were truly promoting coexistence. This rhetoric of friendship and family obscured what was in fact a market relationship. And this sort of disjuncture, right, between the economic hierarchy and the narratives is part of similar rhetoric in any setting. And in fact, since I'm giving this talk in Charleston, I'll say that there's been research done about white employers of Black domestic labor who told very similar stories over the years in different eras of like, well, we get along great, right? And kind of overlooking the particular relationship. Oftentimes, we see, as we move into the present, Jewish individuals who are also hiring Arab workers, often in the West Bank settlements, also talking about coexistence in a similar way. Actually saying, oh, those people on the left don't want coexistence, they want separation. We, on the right, we're the ones who live coexistence. So again, the sense that economic relationships create coexistence. Okay, so these are just a couple of many different stories in which economic development and hierarchical relationships with Arab workers get put together and conveyed to different audiences. So I gave some examples of British audiences, but in many ways, they were most often promoted to Jewish audiences and specifically children, right, as part of educational curricula. So already by the 1920s, but especially in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, the Jewish public was overwhelmingly constituted of Jewish immigrants who had come to mandate Palestine or the new state of Israel, not because they were ardent Zionists necessarily, but because their families faced economic straits or very clear anti-Semitic violence. And the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany only increased the number who arrived. Many of these Jewish arrivals had no inclination to see themselves as rural pioneers. Like, that's not what they were in this game for. But these local elites wanted those new immigrants to see themselves not primarily as immigrants or refugees or, hey, this is just our next home. They wanted them to see themselves as participants in a land settlement project, right, that would truly earn them the land as Jews. And so school curricula, sometimes involving visits, class trips to these moshavot to visit elderly settlers, students often did become proud of that past. And one student in 1961 wrote an essay on the 70th anniversary of Rehovot, yet another colony, who wrote with pride, the small moshavah expanded. The Arab villages that were nearby and would plot murder, theft, and hatred are now settled with Jews from the whole diaspora. So it's like, you know, I am proud of this fact, right? That Jews came and settled and are here, and Arabs are not here. Much like 19th century Ashkenazi or Sephardi Jews in America, or for that matter, Polish or Italian immigrants, these were individuals who took pride in and identified with a settler narrative that began long before their arrival, and particularly became ardent when they faced exclusion or questions about their loyalty, right? They were in, but not fully in the story. And so that enthusiasm was part of claiming their place within the settler narrative of the country. After 1948, Jewish immigration to Israel increased many times over, and Israel absorbed hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants, many of them poor, many of them from post-Holocaust Europe and the Islamic world, the Middle East. And in the 1950s, it began to establish immigrant camps and transit camps, many of them on confiscated Palestinian lands in central areas of the country. Eventually, multiple areas that had been part of Palestinian villages, so those red circles on my map number 3, actually became part of Jewish space. Some of them became new towns, some of them became annexed into some of the same older municipalities that used to hire Arab workers from those villages. So you can see here on the left, this spatial pattern that emerged in which this middle class, older Ashkenazi Jewish core, which sometimes continued to call itself the moshavah, kind of in reference to the past, became surrounded by a periphery that was also a social and political periphery. Many of these were poor immigrants who took up the very agricultural jobs that Palestinian Arabs had left behind, many of them more concerned with making a living and securing some basic rights than participating in something as seemingly irrelevant as historical commemoration of towns that seemed to be neglecting them. And so, given this influx, right, municipalities became ever more eager to do their part to, bring this history to the awareness of new immigrants. They knew that the new immigrants lacked an intuitive connection, and they saw anniversary celebrations as an opportunity to engage them. So 1957, Rishon LeZion celebrates its 75th anniversary, puts together this pamphlet, like a kind of special issue of their local newspaper. One of the articles in that piece juxtaposed the story of an 85-year-old, old settler woman with a newcomer Jewish man from Egypt named Vita Azulai. So Azulai lived in a neighborhood on the city's western periphery, where many new immigrants were settled by the state. The guy who has gone to interview them says, to these immigrants, the name Rishon LeZion means nothing. And in fact, it's true. Azulai had been in the country for only 2 months at the time of the interview. His family situation was not great. Several of his daughters revealed that they were still unemployed. Even those who were employed found their place in a new intra-Jewish labor hierarchy, where Mizrahi, or Jews from Islamic lands, often entered in the lower rungs of these hierarchies. Kind of a new sort of hierarchy emerges. That's not in fact new, that existed before, but really becomes part of the early Israeli story, these Ashkenazi Mizrahi hierarchies. As they promoted the past to these new immigrants, the elites were expressing their fears that these Jews, especially Jews of the Orient or the East, were insufficiently committed and not yet properly civilized. So teaching about the past became a way to bring them up and also to bring them in. So the past, in addition to being narrated and told locally, could also be exported. So in 1960, a winery in Petah Tikva produced a special edition liquor. And the occasion was the 90th birthday of a man named Avraham Shapira, who is shown on the back label, standing guard on a horse. So Shapira, who's actually a pretty major character in the book, although I'm not talking about him a lot here, he was an early colonist in Petah Tikva and a longtime head guardsman, the head of the guards in Petah Tikva, which had been founded in 1878. Shapira had gained the nickname the oldest of the guards, and it's from this that the title of my book comes, The Oldest Guard. So this bottle was made in part for export, and so its label is in English. It suggests to local and global consumers that a drink would take them back to the early years of the mother colony and the foremost of its defenders, Shapira, who dedicated himself to the defense of fields and vineyards. We now supply it to persons of discerning taste for their exquisite enjoyment. So if you're a consumer, I don't know, in the UK, in the United States, Canada, you can imbibe this past, this place of frontier heroism, could also signal your middle class consumer aesthetics, and partake in nationalism through your luxury consumption. So this old guard, in the historical sense, in the political sense, and also in the literal sense, he was old and he had been a guard, could be an object of pride and part of an aspiration to share that pride with others. Shapira is also key to understanding the evolution of that rhetoric of hierarchical coexistence after 1948. So as I mentioned, Zionist and then Israeli forces displaced more than 700,000 Palestinians. 150,000 Palestinians remained within what became the borders of Israel as internally displaced people, some of them internally displaced. In 1952, those who were physically in residence were granted Israeli citizenship, but were subject to military government out of a fear that they could constitute a potential fifth column. On November 20th, 1957, more than 400 Jewish and Palestinian Israelis gathered in Kafr Qasim, which was one of several Arab villages in the central region of the country that survived the 1948 war. The previous year, Israel's border police had committed the massacre of 48 Palestinian citizens after residents of the village unknowingly disobeyed a military government curfew. So first, Israel tries to cover up the massacre, and then as it becomes known, the government arranges a sulha. What is a sulha? It's a long-standing Arab mode of reconciliation typical in rural Palestine and other parts of the Middle East, kind of restorative justice, we might call it today. Who do they choose to preside? Avraham Shapira. So there he is. So in some ways, the choice of the term Solha reproduced an image of Palestinians as ancient tribesmen who did not understand modern judicial procedures, right? Instead of using a formal legal process, they used this other mechanism. But in many ways, the choice of Solha and also the choice of Shapira as its chairperson also promoted an image of early Jewish settlers as people who could make peace with Arabs in informal ways, kind of outside the political mechanisms of the state. Shapira was also celebrated by Petah Tikva, his hometown, in other ways. In 1961, Petah Tikva honored him by planting a Jewish National Fund forest in his honor. And it was built on part of the remains of Hula, which was a village nearby Petah Tikva that had been destroyed in 48. So Kfar Qasim survived, Hula destroyed, and it became the site of an honorary plaque. In fact, part of the celebration noted the good relations with Arabs that Shapira had had throughout his life. So you can see the kind of layers that are going on after 1948. The scholar Kevin Brunio, up in Boston, comments on settler memory. He calls it the capacity to both see and not see Native people. And in fact, I found in my research that 3 different modes of remembering coexist. We have moments where it seems that Arabs are not here at all. Why even mention them? We see moments where they're here and look how good our relations are with them. And third, we see moments of they're here and they're threatening, and we're justified in undertaking retaliatory measures against them. And this constantly shifts, present and not present, friendly and hostile. And this kind of claim is not unique to Israel by any means. We find it also in other comparative contexts. So most of my book charts commemoration through the period of the 1920s through the 1960s. But I couldn't help but find resonances into the present. So the conclusion of my book tries to bring some of this stuff into the period after 67, when Israel captures additional land and begins to allow or even encourage Jewish settlements on parts of that land. So if we look at more contemporary sources, we see ideas of economic peace as pathways presented, especially by the political right, as the best way forward, right? Economic entanglements and hierarchies as the best pathway forward. It's also in the settlement context where settler consumers have a great number of everyday but limited experiences of interacting with Palestinian employees. It's also true in the Galilee and also in some other parts of the country. And an anthropologist who looked at them observed that many of those consumers had their wistful references to individual Palestinians who they worked with or encountered, even though those sentiments were mixed in with broader anti-Palestinian sentiments. So these economic relationships, because they involve market mechanisms, right? I hire you, you do work, we get along well. These kinds of relationships often seem to be non-political, at least to the employers, right? Or beyond politics. And in many ways, that kind of narrative has resonance with the narratives put forward by these First Aliyah settlers, these private owners, these farming communities. All right, so I want to conclude. This is my last slide. Picture of my book. Who's that on the cover? That's Avraham Shapira. There he is, the oldest guard. On one of my research visits in an improvised archive reading room in the basement of a municipality building, I found an archival folder of materials related to an 80th anniversary celebration in Zichron Yaakov, 1962. And one of those documents contained a very interesting assertion. When the historian comes in future generations he'll look back objectively and conclude whatever he concludes. But for now, when we come to survey the past with its shadows and its light, we can proudly summarize it as a period that built the foundations of the Jewish homeland. The implication is that the local memory makers had the duty to be deliberately selective. They had the duty to encase the colony's past in bottles as dignified as those that contained its famous wines. So what kind of relations do we see when we tell a story of early Jewish settlement beyond labor Zionism? How might we think about the past of settlement as a past that continues to be made and contested, both by those who participate as workers and those who have the power to structure relations in the present? I want to close by saying that my great-grandfather's sister, Rachel, died in 1938 in New York after a difficult life. Not only did she lose her first husband, she ultimately lost a second husband as well, and she also lost one daughter to sickness and one son in World War II. And I don't know what story of Rishon LeZion she or my great-grandfather would have wanted me to tell if they were alive today. But I hope that the many stories I do tell somehow honor their memory, as well as the memory of many others whose names aren't present in the stories, but bubble up and continue to resonate as we try to understand and tell them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating talk, and we still have a few minutes left for questions. So please, if anyone has any questions, please do. Raise your hand and we'll let you ask your question.
Yes, and if you could introduce yourself, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, my name is Robert Eisenstadt. So it occurs to me that when I'm listening to you, I kind of listen to you through the lens of a 21st century Jew. It appears that the relationship between Arab and Jew, if you will, the Ashkenazi Jews, under the Ottoman rule, the pre-World War I period, seems to have been a lot more symbiotic, and with the possible exception of maybe exploitative wage practices and so forth. Is that true? And could you mark the demise of Arab-Jewish relations as beginning with the exclusionary labor practices of the Zionist movement moving forward?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure.
Thank you.
So the question is, is it right to look back on these labor practices of the late Ottoman period of 1890s or very early 1900s as symbiotic, kind of basically workable? When did that change? Would I mark the end of that kind of symbiosis with these Hebrew labor practices that came in the early 20th century? Well, the first point is that they were symbiotic only in the sense that, like, economically it worked and proceeded, right? Like, these people needed employment and those people provided employment. The sources indicate that it was often exploitative. This was a moment of major economic transition in Palestine broadly. A time that wage labor was coming in larger ways, that the export economy was growing, a lot of migration within the region, a time of real upheaval for peasants. And so exploitative labor practices were no means limited to Jewish employees. There were also Arab landowners who also had exploitative practices. And actually, this was part of the critique of these labor Zionists is, oh, you're just like those exploitative Arabs. So is that symbiotic? Well, only in the sense that things got much, much worse later. And in fact, they did get worse in part because of the wholesale exclusion of Arab workers from later communities that were founded on different ideological premises. And ironically, kind of founded precisely because these Jewish workers didn't want to be exploiting Arab labor. Like, we're not going to exploit them, we're just going to not include them at all. In fact, the not including them at all presented a different set of problems and a different kind of displacement that many historians actually of multiple political inclinations see as the instigation of a period of separation and growing conflict. Yeah.
Was there one of these two practices that the Arab workers at the time saw as preferable, or were they both, exploitative?
Well, the First Aliyah practices were familiar to them. For the most part, it allowed them to remain where they were and continue to do work. If they had been working for an Arab owner before, now they're working for a Jewish owner. And as long as things remained stable, they were okay with it. The problem was some of these Jewish owners, though they were employing these guys, also had different ideas about private property. So whereas one of these peasant laborers was maybe accustomed to grazing their sheep or maybe growing some of their own, foods on that land, now these owners are saying, oh no, of course you can't do that. You can't graze on our lands anymore. So you end up with these local conflicts that emerge over these changes, sort of smaller and larger, about the rules of the game. And so looking back, there are multiple sources that say, oh, it was much better then. But in fact, sort of a question of, what are you comparing? And how do later events influence the way people look backwards? Yeah.
So I just wanted to share, touched on it a little, but you had mentioned earlier some of your sources being like the JNF archives, and I wanted to hear a little bit on how did you go about finding these sources of people's opinions?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as some of you, I don't know how many of you do research in Israel or maybe you can attest, is oftentimes it's very kind of personal and informal. That's not necessarily the case of the largest archives, which have more procedures, but these local archives tend to be pretty small. There's like one person who works there and maybe some volunteers from the community. And so it's very informal, and it's a lot about building a rapport. So the fact that I had this family story was hugely useful. Like, not just useful, like I was excited to tell it, and they were just super excited to hear that I was doing this because, not only because, but for them, it's like, oh, well, you have this family connection. Sometimes they give me cookies and tea while looking at 100-year-old documents, which is not good archival practice. And I'm very friendly about it. No, it's kind of frightening, actually. But yeah, so, I went in initially not really knowing what I was looking for, because, I thought I was looking to this family story, and then it was this, and then it was that. But part of the reason I got into this issue of commemoration is that many of the sources that the archives did have were not actually from the 1890s. They were from later decades, where they had started more to organize stuff. And why? Because it was part of the commemoration itself. So these archives emerged because people started saying, hey, we have this past and we have to remember it. So they started organizing anniversary celebrations, and there were planning committees, and the protocols of the committees get preserved in the 50th anniversary folder and the 60th anniversary folder. So once I realized that, I went to other local archives and said, I'd love to see whatever you have on anniversaries and anniversary commemorations. Some of them have museums, and there was planning that went into place for creating exhibits. So I could look at early plans of what exhibits should include, or I found this great folder. Once I knew who some of the key figures were, who lived to old age, who kept being involved, like Shakira and some others, I would search for their names. And I found this wonderful, huge folder of letters that school children had sent to this one old guy, Menashe Meirovich, in Rishon LeZion, after visiting. So they'd go on a school trip, and then I guess their teacher would be like, okay, now our activity is to write a letter to this guy. They'd write these super cute emails. Some of them would draw pictures. Actually, this, go back there. So this picture is a picture drawn by one of the school children, often sort of depicting farming or horses or whatever, but also the letters. And so that's where I got some of the sense of how the students received this, or at least how they were being encouraged to remember what they had experienced on these visits.
Let me just, we have one question that came in from the chat. That's about the translation of moshavot as colonies, which, like you, that's how I would translate it. I don't see a better way, but the question is, can you define then the word colony? How do you perceive it?
Yeah, this is, of course, and I'm sure the questioner realizes this is a very loaded question, because, and the reason it's loaded is that the way we talk about colonies and colonization, colonialism, has become a very freighted topic, and not recently, really since you know, the anti-colonial movements of the 60s and 70s. Right, at the time of these, you know, early agricultural colonies, like colonization was, it was, if anything, a kind of a positive undertaking. It was, hey, we're gonna go, we're gonna engage in agriculture and economic development, you know, we're gonna create, bring like modern agricultural practices. And so they use the word colonies, moshavot, and they themselves, when writing in English for the British, would translate it as colonies. So this is not, you know, it wasn't like a controversial thing. As you know, as time has gone on and this issue of, you know, anti-colonial movements became more prominent, you know, there has been, you know, some attempts to, well, no, it wasn't like the bad kind of colonies, like it was a different kind of colony. And there are many ways in which there are some key differences, especially around the way that, you know, Zionists would narrate their relationship to the land. But there are other ways that, you know, you take a bunch of people, you settle in a place, acquire land, you know, engage in economic relationships, it disrupts a place, right? Even if they hope that it's disrupting it for the better, which they did, right? It's disrupting the place. And so when you see it in conversation with other places that occurred, you can make some interesting analytical comparisons, even if you acknowledge the differences. And so, you know, I think sort of there's two answers. One is, hey, they use this term. And two, you know, even admitting that this is, you know, very contentious, there are things that we can see in comparisons that we can make to help us understand this case, if we understand it as one variety of a diverse phenomenon known as colonization. Yes.
Apart from the sort of political and philosophical and the not wanting to hire Arab laborers, what are some of the other differences in terms of like farming? Were the old guard the better farmers? I mean, did the new people have any technology or knowledge? Did they grow different crops? I mean, it sounds like a very intricate sort of.
Yeah, the bottom line is for decades, they didn't really know what they were doing at all. So part of the reason that this new model of labor came in the 1910s and 20s is that things really were not going well in the early colonies. Not necessarily because the labor practices were the problem, at least not on an economic level, but they were sometimes growing crops that weren't very successful. Sometimes there'd be bad weather in the winter and everything would just die. So Edmund James Rothschild of the Paris, France, of the Rothschild baking family, as part of his own commitments to like economic productivization, comes in and actually tries to not only support these farmers, but also bring a different kind of like logic, like, oh, why don't we try this different kind of, you know, crops? Why don't we use this different kind of plowing or different kinds of irrigation? There's a book by a historian named Derek Penzler about some of these technocratic innovations that get brought in. And often on the basis of colonial experience elsewhere in the world. Like, oh, well, the French tried this in Algeria, like, let's try this in Palestine. Right? Not because they assessed the situations as identical, but because, you know, these were spaces for experimentation agriculturally. So there were some French models and some German models that came in, and, you know, different ideas of labor practices. And then by the 1920s, citrus in particular became a big money maker, although it too had its ups and downs. And then there's also industrialization that occurs, and increasing parts of the, you know, kind of product is coming not necessarily out of agriculture, but through industry and other kinds of services. So, yeah.
So when you first originally started researching your family's history and your story and everything, did you always want to plan on writing a book, or is that something that kind of just happened later and you realized you had so much information?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, part of the simple answer is that that's, you know, what academics are supposed to do. If you're a professor, at least in my field, it's a field of articles and publishing is very much the way that we, you know, share our findings and get recognized in the field. And so I knew that I was looking for something that I wanted to make into a book, but I needed to find the right topic. I needed to find something that could lend itself to, you know, a several 100-page book. And so eventually you know, it's also about finding sources. Like I said, I couldn't really find a lot on the 1890s, but hey, all these anniversaries. So you kind of move in the direction of where your sources are. Yeah.
So in the beginning of the talk, you were mentioning how a lot of Jews were sort of seeking refuge in Palestine at the time.
Yeah.
And I guess something that confusing me a little bit is how did they come from like the sort of refugee status to having this economic stronghold over the situation at the time? And then also, was that the same group of individuals kind of were in this more colonializing status or not?
Yeah, great question. In fact, one of the lectures in one of my history classes deals with this precisely, because it's actually very important. I tell my students, you know, if I tomorrow say, oh, I think my pathway to economic productivity is to like move to France and buy land, like I would need to get a visa. Like I need, like there are hurdles I would have to, you can't just like do it because you think it's a good idea. And in fact, part of the reason this was possible in Ottoman Palestine, Yaron is more, you know, even more expert than I am on the Ottoman context. The Ottomans, starting in the mid-19th century, are instituting a whole variety of reforms, including land reform, trying to streamline the way they collected taxes. And also they were trying to encourage foreign investment because the empire already for more than a century is experiencing kind of an economic decline. And one of the ways they do this is by allowing subjects or nationals of European empires or states to kind of come in and invest. And so those who came in to Palestine from Eastern Europe came in as subjects or citizens of their European country. They retained those citizenships and were able to, you know, invest and buy land on the basis to enter and then to acquire land. Now the Ottoman Empire kind of got wind that this is raising troubles, and they try at various moments to say, well, actually, we're going to limit it in this way or that way. But in practice, it's that entry of Europeans more broadly, including in the early years, mainly European Christians, right? Church organizations, missionary organizations, that they come in a moment where there's a possibility for European investment. Then when the British come, they create this category of Palestinian citizenship, which Jews are eligible for. So Jews and Arabs in the British mandate get this thing called Palestinian citizenship. Right, there's no more Ottoman citizenship to be had, so that distinction of which Jews were or were not Ottoman citizens becomes irrelevant, politically speaking. Although culturally speaking, there's a whole story of Ottoman Jews. There are Jews both in Palestine and elsewhere in the empire who were Ottoman citizens, and that had some very important implications also for their relations with these new agricultural settlers.
We have time for maybe one more. Or not. That's okay too.
Okay.
All right, so thank you very much. That's really all I have to say.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Great questions from everyone. Thanks for all for being here.
Thank you.